Good afternoon. You're tuned into the Labor Forum here at WFG 89.3 FM in what was a stormy and maybe now is a sunny day here in Atlanta. My name is Diane Mathewitz. I'm the co-host of this program. I'm a retired auto worker, a member of UAW Local 34 here in Atlanta. I worked for 30 years for General Motors, and so you see lots of the vehicles that I helped work on driving the streets of Atlanta. And if you park next to me, I might come out and talk to you about your car or your van. I'm joined by co-host Kenyon Beasley. Hi, Kenyon. He is with the Postal Workers Union.
Yes. Good afternoon.
And today we have Terence Courtney in the studio as well. He's going to do the labor history reading that we do that Paul McLennan, who's the Amalgamated Transit Workers Union, provided for us. And we're going to have a call-in from Boston. And then we're going to have a discussion continuing what we had talked about last Monday, which is the impact, what it means when for-profit businesses are able to access public funds to build things like stadiums. So before we begin, opinions that are expressed on this program may not necessarily be those of the Board of Directors, staff, or volunteers here at WRFG. This program is, of course, a core program of the mission of this station. We are a community radio station and a progressive, independent community radio station. And that means that we can program for those people and those sections of the population that are often left out, disparaged, not given due respect in the corporate media. I think we're about ready to start with our headline news. I do want to remind everyone who's listening, whether you're listening via your radio, on your computer at wrfg.org, on a mobile app, or if you're watching our live video stream at the Labor Forum YouTube channel, that this is the first of 3 weeks of the summer pledge drive here at WRFG. And as we often mention, we are both a community listener sponsored, and that sort of means that you also need to help make sure that the station has enough funds to continue to operate. Those of you who are regular listeners to WRFG know that we only have 2 people who have our paid staff, and that is a station manager and our operations director, and that everybody else here is a volunteer, and that includes all of the people that you hear on air 24/7. They all do their shows without receiving any monetary compensation. The compensation we get is the joy of doing radio, the pleasure of being able to speak to literally thousands and thousands of people, to present the music, the news, the analysis that we want to share. So we'll start right off with that. If Kenyon will go ahead and do the labor headlines today. There was a lot of breaking news in the news today.
Yeah, breaking news. The Supreme Court, as a matter of fact, came down with a decision. Today, the Supreme Court released 2 decisions, both by 5-4 votes that continue the attack on working people. In Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, the 5 conservative justices ruled that profit-making corporations owned by a small number of closely tied individuals, such as family, cannot be required to provide contraceptive services in the contraceptive care in the insurance plans that they offer to the employees. And such devices or methods are against their religious beliefs. The court ruled this only applied to women's reproductive health measures and not to other medical options such as blood transfusions. While the majority of businesses offer contraceptive care, it is unknown how many women will be affected by this decision. Hobby Lobby has some 15,000 employees at 600 stores across the U.S. The other decision is the Harris versus Quinn, which is a blow to public sector unions. It comes out of Illinois, where many home care workers are unionized. Those paid by Medicaid funds were considered public employees and were represented by SEIU, whether they actually joined the union or not. They were required to pay fees to cover the cost of this representation. The Supreme Court ruled that this narrow group could not be required to pay for this service. In both cases, while the decisions did not go as far as the right-wing, anti-women, anti-worker forces had hoped, nonetheless, it indicates the position of the majority on the Supreme Court to rule in favor of employers and against the workers and women. The Labor Forum will continue to discuss the implications of these cases in future programs. Locally, the Clayton County Commission is scheduled to vote on Tuesday whether to include a referendum on the fall ballot to add either a half penny or 1 cent to the sales tax to bring modern bus and rail line into the county. Public transportation will be a great boost to many workers, students, seniors, and anyone without a car living in Clayton County. It would expand job and other opportunities throughout the metro area. We'll be covering this issue as well in future programs. And lastly, for today, another totally preventable tragedy has occurred in Bangladesh, that's India, right? Bangladesh, where if you remember in April of 2013, some 1,100 garment workers died in the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory. On June 20th, the Medla Apparel factory caught fire, injuring 50 workers who were unable to exit the building. Medla Apparel supplies VF Corporation with its North Face brand garments, which are sold at REI stores. The fire was blamed on a faulty electrical system. A worker complains about no fire doors, open stairways that only went to the ground floor, and no outside exit when unheeded both by the local owners and the VF Corporation. Garment workers in Bangladesh continue to mobilize and demonstrate for safe working conditions and to end slave wages.
Thanks, Kenyon. You know, this news about the Supreme Court decisions, both of these cases were being very closely watched because of the implications, as I mentioned, or as you mentioned, that they really are a slippery slope. The idea that a corporation, a for-profit corporation, has religious beliefs that need to be respected as part of a constitutional right. And that the rights of workers to have adequate, complete health care offered to them come secondary to this nebulous idea that a corporation has a religious belief.
Well, they're supposed to be people.
And that is the situation, frankly, we were talking about, where corporations actually are now gaining all of the rights that people have, and people are losing every single one of them. And then this other one, I have to say that I hadn't heard as much about it, the case that came out of Illinois. I don't know, Terence, whether you were as familiar with that. I had to read up on it a little bit today because there were numerous articles about it. Because what it essentially seems to me is that public employees now, at least I've read, at least a third of public employees are unionized, and that the rate of workers who work for private corporations has shrunk to 6 or 7%, something really small. And so it's very clear that the anti-labor forces in the country have their, there's a big old target on the back of every public employee, and it seemed as though this law, or this ruling, could have really very serious ramifications for public employees. What I read said that the justices narrowly defined the groups that were being impacted, but as we know, the gate has been opened.
Yes, Diane, and I think what we're seeing here in this example with the public employees is Illinois fits right along with the subject matter of our conversation today, which is the neoliberal attack on the public sphere. You know, one of the key elements of neoliberalism is to gobble up public institutions and public property and turn those into for-profit privatized entities. And the same is true with labor. In many ways, what the neoliberals would like to do is to privatize this public form of work and service and turn that into something that's less about serving the needs of human beings in Illinois and more about turning their labor into still more profit. So when we see attacks on public sector unions, we should keep in mind that this is part of the capitalist neoliberal agenda.
Thanks so much, both of you, for Kenyon for the headlines and Terence for that comment. don't know if I introduced Terence. Terence Courtney is with Black Alliance. Oops, yes, Black Alliance for Just Immigration. BAJI. I was going to do BAJI, and I had to think for a second with all the letters too. Anyway, Terence is going to join us occasionally on the labor forum programs. And before we continue with the this week in labor history segment, I want to make sure, of course, that all of you, and if you've been listening to any of the programs since midnight, you, of course, do know that we are in our pledge drive. And I want to make sure you know of all the ways that you can make your contribution to the station as a whole, but to the labor forum in particular. You can call 404-523-8989. That number should be engraved in everybody's mind. And you also can go online at wrg.org, and that's a way to pledge anytime, 24/7, securely with your credit card, and it's the whole slew of credit cards that many people have. And you also can actually opt for which program you would like your contribution to be attributed to. And the labor forum is a good candidate for that, as well as all the other programs that will precede us and come after us. So with that, again, I want to really remind everyone that if you value the information, the discussion, the knowledge that you gain from listening to WRFG's public affairs programs, particularly the labor forum, please do call in. And I thought Kenyon has a challenge.
Yeah, I do have a challenge. And it goes on, well, it's being issued by the American Postal Workers Union Local 32. And what we like to do with everyone that calls in and pledges $50, I'm sorry, for the first 5 people. For the first 5 people that pledge $50 to the labor forum show, we'll match that $50. So 404-523-8989. Please call in. Labor forum.
All right, super. That would be a good thing. So, Terence, do you want to go ahead and read for us this, what this date in history meant for working for people in this country?
Absolutely, Diane. We really can't talk about workers' rights or labor in the United States without discussing the long history of slavery and how unpaid labor for 400 years built this country and the foundation of its economic power. So this Friday, the United States will celebrate the 4th of July, which commemorates the adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, and it declared independence from Great Britain. The words, quote, freedom and independence, end quote, had meaning only for a privileged few white male property owners. This is proven by the fact that during the same week, on July 2nd, 1822, Denmark Vesey was executed for organizing the most elaborate and well-planned slave insurrection in the history of the United States. Denmark Vesey was born around 1767, probably in St. Thomas, Danish West Indies. As a child, he was sold in 1781 to a Bermuda slave trader, captain named Joseph Vesey, who frequented the slave markets of Barbados and Saint-Domingue, which was the French possession that later became the Republic of Haiti. Denmark Vesey was 14 at the time, and his given name was Telemaque. Captain Vesey sold him to a plantation owner in Charleston, who put him to hard labor chopping sugarcane. At this time, South Carolina was the only state in the country to have a black majority. In 1820, the city of Charleston had 57,221 slaves and 19,776 whites, which made it demographically and literally an African-American community. Vesey, who spoke French as well as English, became a leader in the African-descendant community, which was ruled over by a small white minority, whose greatest fear was a slave rebellion. On November 9, 1799, Denmark Vesey won a $1,500 lottery, which he used that money to buy his freedom and set himself up as a carpenter. He tried unsuccessfully, however, to buy the freedom of his wife. Then in 1815, whites in Charleston discovered that black Methodists had been secretly pooling money to buy freedom for enslaved congregants. So whites moved to restrict black autonomy. When whites began planning the construction of a hearse house on top of a black burial ground. Black people in Charleston saw this as the final insult. So over 4,000 black members left white churches in protest and formed the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. Denmark Vesey followed them, leaving the segregated Second Presbyterian Church, where slaves were taught the words of St. Paul, quote, "Servants, obey your masters," end quote. In the AME Church, Vesey found the freedom to preach his beliefs. In reaction, the church was temporarily shut down by white authorities in 1820, then again in 1818, then again in 1820. Inspired by the revolutionary spirit and actions of slaves in 1791, those slaves in the Haitian Revolution, and the furious actions of people in Charleston, Vesey began to plan a slave rebellion. His insurrection, which was to take place on Bastille Day, July 14, 1822, became known to thousands of blacks throughout Charleston and along the Carolina coast. The plan called for Vesey and a group of slaves and free blacks to attack the guardhouses and arsenals to seize arms, execute the slave masters, and temporarily liberate the city of Charleston. Finally, Vesey and his followers planned to sail to Haiti to escape retaliation. Warned by a house servant, white authorities on the eve of the scheduled outbreak made massive military preparations, which forestalled the insurrection. During the ensuing months, some 130 blacks were arrested. In the trials that followed, 67 were convicted of trying to raise an insurrection. Of these, 35, including Vesey, were hanged and 32 condemned to exile. In addition, 4 white men were fined and imprisoned for encouraging the plot. After the executions of Denmark Vesey and 34 others, Charleston authorities exiled the African church leaders and razed the building. Although devastated by the destruction of their church, black Charlestonians continued to honor Vesey's revolutionary Old Testament theology in secret. For abolitionists, however, such as David Walker, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, Vesey became a symbol of resistance and an inspiration in their writings. This has been your history, or labor history, for this week.
Thanks a lot. So I'm trying to think of an appropriate kind of comment to make. You know, that's just so close by, Charleston, and tourists go there all the time, and many of them trod on the marketplace where literally tens of thousands of Africans were sold.
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking about the population at that time. It's almost even double what the population of the slaves, but double what the population of the ruling class, I guess, at that particular time. That's something. That is.
Well, that shows you, one, how necessary black slave labor was, and they had to have great numbers to, produce the profits that they needed. Talking about sugarcane in Charleston, but in other parts of the South there was tobacco, rice, indigo, any number of crops, king cotton, as it were, and they needed large numbers of working people in the fields. But not only in the fields, they performed other duties. They were carpenters, they were builders. They did every form of work one could imagine that was needed in a city at that time. And they had to have those numbers. But at the same time, having those numbers also created a great fear and dread in the white leadership, or I should say elites at that time, because they understood that, if the people were to organize themselves and have a good plan, they could overthrow the situation.
I think the other thing that's interesting that I had never heard was that there were 4 white men who were engaged in this plot. And I only speak of that because while it's true that many of the slaveholders formed this very elite crust of society. There nevertheless were also white workers who had a variety of jobs, and although their status was higher, nevertheless they were terribly exploited as well. So it's interesting to note that in that period of time there was a form of solidarity where these four white men apparently took a very brave stance to align themselves, to sign up for what was going to be, a rebellion of major proportions.
And conversely, the whole plan was spoiled by oppressed person spilling the beans to the white elites, right? So, it's a very complicated situation, and you have internalized oppression as a part of the scene. Then it's very difficult to make advancements, and in many ways we still struggle with that today as we organize. You have a few people from our community, the Black community, who don't want to participate in the struggle. They in many ways want to keep the status quo because they benefit from it in some way, or they're just plain afraid, as Paulo Freire would say, they fear freedom.
So we had been hoping that we were going to get a call this afternoon from Gary Murchison, who would be calling in from Boston. And in an hour and a half, there's going to be a major solidarity rally. We've had a couple of programs where we've heard from the Boston school bus drivers who are members of the steelworkers local there. They are Haitian, Camp Verdean, African-American dominated union that has fought for education, for equal and quality education for all of Boston's children, and as well as worker rights, decent pay, and working conditions. And this past summer, in August, a company named Veolia, which is going to become a name very well known here in Atlanta as well, got the contract for the Boston school bus busing program. And before the ink was even dry on the paper, they started abrogating literally every section of that contract. And one of the things that this then led to is that this is a union which has a very proud history of standing up for its rights. And so in October, the drivers came into the yard to get their buses, but they also demanded that they have a meeting with the Veolia management. And the managers locked the gates, wouldn't let them get into the buses, and then called the press and said that the bus drivers had committed an illegal wildcat strike. So then 4 of the union's both founders and leading members, who have a long history in Boston, were fired by the company. And there has been a multi-month effort to get, not only just to get their jobs back, but to end this kind of union busting, vicious, anti-worker policies of this company, Veolia. Gary Murchison, who was one of the fired bus drivers, was expected to call in today, and we were going to talk about that. I suspect that they are getting ready to have a major demonstration right at the offices of Veolia at 6 o'clock. So I am assuming that some of the details of organizing that demonstration has gotten in the way of him being able to make that call. Now, here's the deal about Veolia. Last week we learned that they run the
CCT.
Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yep.
And they just got the contract out at the airport for these shuttle buses that go to downtown under one of their subsidiaries' names. And for all we know, there's some other stuff.
Well, I mean, I think this is, again, how insidious this neoliberalism is, where you see in Boston how the school bus drivers, that work is privatized, right? Veolia that, persuaded the local community to stop paying workers directly in the public sector, and to have this private contractor be a middleman, as it were. And we know what happens in a situation like that. The workers are exploited. They're paid lower wages. They often have to struggle to get any kind of meager benefits. And here in Georgia, as you stated, Cobb Community Transit is run by Veolia, and we have to say that the fact that MARTA isn't in Cobb, that has its roots in this program, this historic racist and classist agenda in Metro Atlanta. So rather than have a public sector serve Cobb riders, the leaders of Cobb have determined they'd rather have the system privately controlled and exploited by Veolia. It's so indicative of where we are today.
And there's more information about Veolia. It's actually a French-based company, but it's global. And one of the other contracts that it does have, or did have until recently, and I believe public protest ended it, is that in the state of Israel, there are Jewish-only buses. And Veolia was the contractor who drove the Jewish-only buses. So no Arab, no Palestinian could get on this bus to go anywhere. So essentially an apartheid bus. So they or a Jim Crow bus in here, same sort of situation. And they also, there's a strike actually right now in Sweden. Veolia is in Sweden, and their bus drivers actually have made actually did a poster that they put out in Sweden in support of this rally that's taking place in Boston today in support of the Boston school bus drivers. So all of that would have been information that Gary Murchison would have given us. We will try very hard to see if we can get them on next week to let us know what happened at this rally. So I'm going to suggest one more time that we have a challenge that if the first 5 people who make a $50 pledge, the Postal Workers Union will match that. And that would be actually a total of $500 for WRFG and in support of the labor forum. So you also can do this online. You can go online and put your $50 in and note it for the labor forum, and we'll make sure the postal workers know that it happened that way as well. We're going to go ahead and take a very short break. We will be right back, and we're going to have our continuation of our conversation about the impact of how public funds get used for privately owned or operated stadiums and other kinds of developments. We're going to be talking about Brazil, we're going to be talking about Atlanta, we're going to be talking about Cobb County, and we're going to talk about the displacement, how it displaces people in the working class and communities of color. So stay tuned.
It's our birthday. It's our birthday. The WRFG 41st birthday.
Do you want me to play a song?
Will be held on July 12th.
Do you want me to play a song after this?
Yeah.
To add more time?
Oh, well, Gary's not going to call anymore now.
Yeah, so, okay. So after, you got 50 seconds of this, and then you want to go back into it. If somebody does call for this, who's going to answer?
Good question. You are.
I can't do it, I'm not being mad quiet, because you know how sensitive these mics are when you have all of them.
Yeah.
Oh, you're fine. It's so weird, like, when you touch it, or you don't do it, like, it's like, it's super dangerous.
Additional funds will attract include the kids zone, a variety of vendors, a cake raffle, and a celebration with the birthday cake for our 41st year on air. Come out and have a splendid and fabulous time. For more information, call 445-347.
Oh, okay.
Hi, you are listening to the Labor Forum. This is Diane Mathewitz, co-host of the Labor Forum and retired auto worker. And Terence Courtney, who is with Black Alliance for Just Immigration and who has been active in the workers' movement here in Atlanta and around the South. for a couple of decades. He looks young, though, for those of you who are watching on the video. We're going to have a continuation of this conversation that we started last week with Anita Beatty, who is Executive Director of the Metro Atlanta Task Force for the Homeless, and Ben Howell, who is a Cobb County citizen and also Amalgamated Transit Worker member. And they sort of started this program, this discussion off. What prompted it, of course, was that we had seen the worldwide interest in the World Cup in Brazil, but more than the millions and millions who are interested in the outcome of each of the games, we had also noted that literally millions of people had taken to the streets in Brazil for a number of months, raising the issue of how public money in a country with a huge, desperately poor population had essentially turned over just untold wealth that had been produced and contributed by working people in Brazil over to FIFA to build stadiums for these games. And that prompted a discussion here, because Atlanta is no stranger to how that happens, from the '96 Olympics to the first Brave Stadium to the TED to the Falcon Stadium to the now second Falcon Stadium, and of course the new Cobb Stadium for the Braves. So last week we kind of were talking about how this process of the use of large capital controlled by small numbers of people essentially overrules any kind of public policy where you might think that housing or transportation, clean air, and a whole variety of education might be the priorities of the community, and instead it's big stadiums. So this week we mostly wanted to talk again about other impacts, specifically how it displaces communities, and this is experienced in Brazil, but it's also experienced here. Terence has been active around this issue for some time, and so that's what we're going to talk about now. And I think most of our listeners would be totally in agreement that there's not very much public input about anything about these stadiums, other than maybe trying to figure out how to divvy up a few little crumbs that are tossed to these communities that get displaced. And they are supposed to try to figure out how to remedy all the ills that both are prior to the stadium coming and are going to come as a result of the stadium. And they're supposed to try to figure out how to take a few $1 million and fix it. So if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit about what you think the root cause of how it is this handful of team owners or big developers are able to essentially turn upside down the notion of something called public money or public space.
Well, I think to understand this, Diane, let's paint a picture for our listeners. The picture starts 40 years ago, and it's really a consequence of the enormous gain the public made in the 60s and 70s through social movements like the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the LGBT movements. These movements really opened up space for what is what one could call the public good, where we saw actually transfers of wealth from the top down to the people who actually produce the value in our society. And so 40 years ago, the white supremacists, the capitalists, and the patriarchs said, we can't allow this notion of public wealth to continue to grow. And so they implemented a campaign or a strategy called Neo-Liberalism to beat back the gains made in the 60s and 70s. And key to that.
Can I just ask a question right here? Because I think when people hear the word Neo-Liberalism, they think new, better. We all think, everything's new and improved.
Right.
New and improved liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it that neoliberalism is the opposite of what you would describe as liberal public policy?
Well, that's an excellent question because it really clarifies. So when we say neoliberalism, we're not talking about the kind of liberalism most people associate with, say, Democratic Party, where there's this political liberalism that sort of hangs in the middle between radical change and conservatism. It's really about liberating capitalism. It's about taking off the shackles and constraints on free markets. So when we're talking about neoliberalism, we're talking about a new way to free up capitalism to gobble up the public sector and public institutions and public property.
So for example, all the trade agreements that erase borders and tariffs is this form of neoliberalism because it allows capital to just go anywhere it wants in the world and then puts workers in chains if they try to follow the capital.
Right, and it goes all over the world, and many times it manifests itself in these policies we're talking about today, like the $11 billion that was used to host the World Cup instead of used to improve Brazil's public transit, public schools, public housing, public hospitals, all of which have gone underfunded for decades, and it's much the same here. In many ways, what Baji is saying is that these neoliberal policies that displace and dispossess that we see are also some of the key drivers of immigration. People are leaving these distressed parts of the world, be that in the so-called third world or even here in the United States, like Detroit. People are leaving those places. They're migrating to new places where they hope to find opportunities. But unfortunately, wherever you go today, you run into these same problems, be it Brazil, Atlanta, or Cobb County.
So I want to we had said that we wanted to talk a little bit about the forms of displacement. So very obviously, last night there was it was called a farewell ceremony or event taken at Friendship Baptist Church, which is one of the two historic Black congregations that have been displaced, destroyed by the new Falcon Stadium. They just wanted to move just a little bit further so it could be closer to the MARTA station. And so this event took place last night. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go, but in today's Atlanta Constitution, a woman wrote a very good letter, really about what a crime this was, not just to displace anything for a stadium that's going to make more money for a man who's already a billionaire, but also the historic role, what Friendship Baptist represented, both as the incubator, the starter of Spelman, civil rights location for so many people. The Abernathys went there. It's just a variety of things, and that a city that just opened a museum for civil and human rights simultaneously is now preparing to bulldoze down this institution, which had been founded by slaves and was over a century old. So would you address both that kind of cultural and psychological displacement, physical displacement, as well as just the fact that people's homes, people's place of businesses, etc., get bulldozed down with very little care when these stadiums are built?
Well, I'm glad you raised that because that's a very important point that you brought up. It's something that I don't think we think about often when we think about gentrification, displacement, vis-a-vis these stadiums. We often think how bad it is that these people are being pushed out. But the point you're making now is very, very important because it speaks to cultural erasure. It speaks to a historical erasure as it relates to Atlanta. And that not only serves the capitalist desires of people involved, right? Because it allows them to make the stadium, which will make them profit. But it also serves a psychological and hegemonic need to erase the Black history of resistance in Atlanta. But this isn't new. Right now, I brought a book today from Larry Keating, who's a professor at Georgia Tech, called Atlanta, Race, Class, and Urban Expansion. And he writes, even back in the late 60s and early 70s, Mayor Even Allen used the Fulton County ball stadium,
The first one.
right, the first one, to displace black folks in Peoplestown and other parts of Black Atlanta, right? So if you drive around this area now, you have no sense that this was a thriving black community before. Now it's all gentrified and people have been pushed out.
Oh, it's a whole lot of parking lots.
Yeah,
And empty buildings.
right. And so, this has been a long-term pattern, right? And that's what we're saying, is that we have to come to see that this is part of a program. These things that happen, like the privatization of grading, right? And one of the key needs of this neoliberal program that shifts public wealth to private hands in this place is that it has to create a crisis in the community. For example, with Grady Hospital, they worked with the governor of the privatizers to withhold $80 million from Grady, which threw it into a financial crisis. And then what did they say? Hey, we have the answer, privatization, right? And so now, increasingly, low income and indigent and people without insurance who once went to Grady are being pushed away. They're being displaced. So the displacement is happening in all sorts of ways. Schools are being closed and privatized. In New Orleans, just recently, they eliminated the last of their public schools. Now it's a 100% charter school district. And we know that the people after Katrina were pushed out and not allowed to return. And we see this over and over and over again.
Let me ask this question, in relation to, again, the argument or the thing that is given is that, well, these neighborhoods are, the land is cheaper there, and if we're going to have a public stadium, then this is where it should be because the land is cheaper there. And also that there's going to be this peripheral, there'll be some jobs, there will, it's going to be an improvement. So now there are, in fact, I believe there are, in fact, a few stadiums around the country where perhaps that happened. I don't believe that that's the norm, and I think the TED is an example of that. And I think what has happened in Greece, you can even look at what in China, these humongous buildings that were built for tens and tens of thousands of spectators. It's not likely that there's many events thereafter, and then you have the upkeep of it. And so all this money has been spent, but there's very little value afterwards.
Well, I mean, we realize that what they use as rhetoric and what really happens often are very different. I don't think they would ever use rhetoric that says, we just want to push these people out to make profit, right? That
even now, that's probably a little too bald-faced.
Too honest. So what they try to do is they have to present it as meeting some need or providing some good to the community. But I really challenge anyone to give me an example where it really did benefit the people who were on the lowest rung in that community. I mean, even the jobs these stadiums provide don't pay a living wage. They don't provide, benefits and other things. They don't have a union. So, I really challenge anyone to convince me that these stadiums benefit anyone but the owners. And to maybe a small degree the players. They make millions, but they're at the end of the day they're workers, right? The owners control everything. So the benefit to these communities is almost zero. And again, what happens is not only do we lose our community and our history, but people are pushed into even lower rungs of the economic ladder.
And I think that's one of the points that we want to really make here on the labor forum, because we talk all the time about how people need jobs. But we do not talk about how people need jobs at slave wages. We don't talk about how we want jobs at any cost. We always talk about how we want jobs that are dignified work, that pay a living wage, that that promote both the health and safety of the person who's doing the job, but also the health and safety of the community where the job is being done. So I think quite often that in this economy and the way capitalism works and the way people are kind of forced to compete for a job at any price, at any cost, to get a job because workers need a job, that this narrative or this excuse or this explanation of how it makes sense to take public money to turn it over to into private hands is somehow beneficial. I really think we've got to just stop that.
We have to do that, and I think that's part of the solution, Diane. We have to keep educating people about this process. We also have to become more organized, those of us who are coming to some realization. And a key solution, I say, is that we have to organize social movements that are politically independent, because we're witnessing states supporting Neo-Liberalism. They support free markets and privatization, and charter schools, and the whole 9 yards. So we must be able to hold anyone accountable who challenges the public good in the public sector. So I think those are key parts of the solution, and we really have to start creating a practice that foreshadows the kind of world we want, where there is more egalitarianism, more democracy, where people have more control over their lives, their future, their economy, and politics.
So last week, for those of you who weren't listening, Ben Howell was here, and he, as I said, was a podcast. And he made the point, and it goes back to what I was talking about, jobs, that he was saying that what Cobb County needs and what all of us need is not just a job, but it is a career. In other words, it is a form of work that is both satisfying to the person and is useful to the society and is paid accordingly. And the other thing we talked about a little bit, of course, was how democracy or any kind of notion of discussion or input is totally done away with when these big dollar folks come in with their bags of money and have a project. The community almost never finds out about it until the blueprints are almost drawn. and then, as I mentioned, a SOP is handed out, where you're going to get so many units of housing to this place, many, many more units of housing, or you're going to get something small in the community. And it's left sort of, again, as I said, you're just getting scraps from the table.
It's unfortunate because I've been involved in struggles, one of which to stop the demolition of public housing in Atlanta. I was in Clayton County a few years ago working with C-Trans riders who were trying to stop the elimination of public transit there. And over again, one of the biggest challenges is the sense that people have internalized that they can't win, that MARTA just going to do what it wants to do, or City Hall is going to do whatever they want to do. And there's a deep sense of resignation. Yes, deep sense of resignation, and that's one of the challenges we have, because people have been taught that they can't win. And I think that's partly because our organizing traditions have, for the last couple of decades, weakened and atrophied in favor of just electoral politics. And I think what we're saying today is that, not that people shouldn't run for office or vote for the right candidate, but we should build up our capacity to fight. We should build up our capacity to expand what we think of as politics beyond the ballot, and create social movements that force any political actor to give people what they want.
That's why I'm really sorry that we didn't have Gary Murchison on as I had hoped, because one of the issues, of course, is here on the Labor Forum is we talk a lot about the right of workers to form a union and to be in a union. But one thing I do think about the Steelworkers Union in Boston is that I think they're an example really of what a real union is, which is that they take up the issues of the community. They see no difference between the fight for decent wages for school bus drivers and quality education for the child in Boston. They see no difference between opposing U.S. wars as they do supporting immigrants from Haiti or who are opposing U.S. imposed government. In other words, they have very much what I see as a class solidarity consciousness. And I have to say to our listeners, that is what I hope you get from listening to the Labor Forum, is that your sense of class solidarity and class action is growing by listening to this program every Monday and the guests that we have on.
And, I want to add, Diane, that it's great too that that example you shared in Boston includes immigrants. You got immigrants from the Caribbean and elsewhere part of that. And what we're saying at Baji is, if you really examine U.S. history, especially in the 20th century, many of the social movements in the United States included immigrants. When you go back to the 1930s, you had people like Claudia Jones and others who were from the Caribbean participate.
Oh, and even earlier, the 8-hour day.
Right.
Those were all immigrants.
RBC. Yeah, he's from the Caribbean. You had, folks from the, African diaspora participating in all these struggles that we're talking about. And I think you're right. At the end of the day, people understand that as working people, we have to stand together and push back against, monsters that are attacking us all.
So we have talked a little bit about these stadiums, and of course, the Falcon Stadium, I guess, is going to get built, and it appears as though the Cobb County Stadium is going to get built. How is it that now that it seems as though those are done, maybe they're not yet? How do you think the communities in both Cobb County and here in Atlanta should be addressing, the future impact of those big developments?
Well, that's a tough question. Very tough. Well, if I, have to think off the top of my head, I would just continue to encourage people to stay organized as best that they can, and to, continue to challenge the process. To my knowledge, the work hasn't begun at construction yet. So that means there's still time. That means that people who want to preserve their communities, who want to stop this draining of the public coffers, they have time to resist. But should the stadiums begin construction, I think there's still room to fight back along the way. It's not done until it's done, and even after they're completed, people can still be observant and watch how the impact of that really hurts the community more than helps.
I think one of the things is that with this fight for the 15 hours minimum wage, that should be the first thing. These workers at the stadiums, these workers at all the so-called enterprises that are going to build up around it, we need to have $15 an hour. And I don't know whether there's a way to incorporate any of that in the struggle around the contracts that are taking place, but that certainly would be a start, that there should be no low-wage jobs. After you've spent millions and millions of public dollars, you should not be underwriting low-wage jobs.
I agree, and I would add that, and that shouldn't mean that the tickets become so out of reach that the public can't attend if they wanted to. So what that means is that, the profits that these stadiums and ball fields make should be shared more equitably with the workers, right, and not necessarily passed on to the consumer.
want to thank you so much, Terence, for coming in today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I want to again express my appreciation for Chris Hollis, who's the engineer here at the Labor Forum each week, and Ozzy Ibrahimi, who does our videoing, so that you can watch us on the Labor Forum YouTube channel. I also want to thank Kenyon Beasley, who had to go back to work, for coming in for half of the program. Next Monday, we will be back, and we're going to be talking about the word independence, what it all means as we start this month where everything is red, white, and blue, and fireworks, and lots of discussion about independence. I want to again remind you that the only way WRG can stay independent is that if you contribute however many dollars you are able to. You can call any program anytime during these next 3 weeks and make your pledge over the telephone to the volunteer who answers. You can do that at 404-523-8989. You can go online at wrg.wrg.org, and you can actually make that pledge, and you can designate it for the Labor Forum or any of the other programs here on WRG, and we will appreciate it very, very much. So until next week, this is Diane Mathewitz saying goodbye.
All right, take care, everybody.
We will not back down to the heart. Very